I picked up her phone to snap a quick photo and landed on a chat that was happening right in the middle of our anniversary dinner. I never thought our relationship could shatter in an instant, especially not on what was supposed to be the happiest night of our lives. My name is Michael, and I've always believed in love that lasts a lifetime. Growing up in a tight-knit suburban community just outside Chicago, church on Sundays wasn't optional, it was sacred. My parents, devout Methodists, instilled in me that marriage was a covenant under God, unbreakable and pure. When I met Emily at the youth group potluck, her laugh, bright as gospel choir, was enough to convince me she was the one. We married 2 years ago in the little chapel where I'd been baptized, surrounded by every familiar face from Sunday school. I figured that by now, on our first anniversary, we'd be reliving those vows with joyful tears. But that night, as Sarah, our waitress at Olivia's Steakhouse, slid a glass of red wine in front of Emily, I reached across the table to take her hand. I noticed her fingers trembling. I asked if she was okay. She smiled that crooked smile I'd come to love, and said she was just nervous about the surprise I had for her. I'd planned a weekend getaway to Lake Geneva. I thought I had it all figured out. We clinked glasses. I raised my phone to capture the moment. Emily in the golden glow of candlelight, eyes shimmering with love. I tapped the camera icon and froze. Her messaging app was open. The chat was titled, "Tomorrow at 9, and the last message read, "Can't wait to see you tonight, she has no idea." My thumb hovered on the screen. I felt my heart pound so loud, I swore the whole restaurant could hear it. I swiped up to scroll, my breath caught in my throat. There it was, time-stamped just 10 minutes ago. During our anniversary dinner. I'm so bored. He keeps talking about his surprise. Can't wait for our rendezvous. The text was from Sarah. Not the waitress, another Sarah. Her name on my phone's contact list was blank, but the silhouette matched Emily's profile picture, her favorite sunset shot from our last beach trip. My world tilted. The plates clattered behind me. The wine glass nearly slipped from my hand. I tried to swallow, forced myself to stay seated, keep breathing. I looked up at Emily. Her lips were curling into that caring smile, but her eyes were fixed on me with an intensity I hadn't seen before, and I didn't know why. I closed the app, pretending nothing was wrong. I snapped the photo, but I couldn't look her in the eyes. My palms were slick with sweat. She reached out to grab my hand. I pulled back, shaking. "What's wrong?" she asked. My voice cracked. "Emily, who's Sarah?" Her smile froze. "You're kidding, right? Sarah from work, you know, my coworker?" I saw the lie in her eyes, flickering like a faulty bulb. "This isn't that Sarah," I whispered. "This is someone else." And I tapped the screen to open the chat again. Her pulse must have surged. She snatched the phone, yanked it away. We stood up. There was a silence so thick I could hear my own heart break. Outside the restaurant, the summer air did nothing to cool me down. Emily was pleading, tears welling up. "Michael, please believe me," she said. "It's not what you think." But the words spilled out like poison. I didn't know whether to breathe or scream. It was snowballing so fast. Every promise we ever made, every wedding photo, every whispered "I love you," felt suddenly upside down. Meaningless. I left her standing on the sidewalk beneath the neon open sign. The one we joked was inviting us back for late-night milkshakes. I got into my car, hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't know where to go. I drove aimlessly, past the church where we said our vows, past the youth center where we first talked. Everything in my town, everything in my life, was a memory now twisted by suspicion. By the time I pulled up in front of my best friend Jason's house, my eyes were bloodshot. Jason answered the door in a faded Chicago Bears tee, concern etched on his face. He wrapped me in a brother's hug. "Dude, what happened?" In the living room, among empty pizza boxes and college memorabilia, I spilled it all. The dinner, the chat, Emily's face, my disbelief. Jason slapped his hand on the couch. "You have to talk to her," he said. "You need answers." But I shook my head. "I don't even know what I want to hear." 2 nights later, Emily showed up at my apartment, standing in the hall like a ghost. She looked smaller, fragile. I opened the door but said nothing. The air between us was electric, unbearably charged. She handed me a letter. "Read this," she whispered, voice trembling. Then she stepped back and closed the door. Inside was pages of text. Handwritten. She confessed that she never meant to hurt me. She wrote about how she'd been feeling invisible, how the excitement had faded after I proposed, after we moved into the new house, how in a work conference last month she'd run into an old college friend, Ryan, and felt alive again in fleeting texts and stolen moments. She said it was never physical, just emotional, but she admitted the private messages were a betrayal, as deep as any affair in flesh. I read and reread her words, searching for sincerity, for a hint of the girl I fell in love with. The letter finished with a plea. "Please, let's talk, face to face. I want to fix this." I closed my eyes. The pain was raw, but I realized something. I still loved her. Even reading those pages, my heart didn't harden into stone. It ached, but it didn't turn away. That Sunday, I found her in the pew in our church, head bowed. The stained glass light painted colors on her shoulders. I sat beside her, silence stretching between hymns. When the pastor's sermon on forgiveness echoed through the hall, I felt a flicker of hope. When we sang Amazing Grace, I glanced at her, tears mixing with the light. I touched her hand. "We're here," I said quietly. She looked at me, relief softening her eyes. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Over the next weeks, we started therapy. Dr. Green, our counselor, asked tough questions. Why did you drift apart? What needs went unmet? I realized how I'd buried my own stresses, promotion at work, caring for my aging dad, behind platitudes about, "We'll discuss it later." Emily confessed how she felt abandoned, lonely, craving validation. We confronted the lies we told ourselves and each other. One evening, she led me to the rooftop of our apartment building at sunset. The city's skyline glowed. She held my hand and said, "Michael, I know I broke your trust. I can't erase it, but I want you to see me, really see me, every day." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small wrapped box. Inside was a compass, engraved with our wedding date. "For finding our way back," she said. Tears stung my eyes. I clasped the compass, then her. Rebuilding trust took time. There were nights we argued, nights I slept in the guest room, nights I questioned if it was worth salvaging. But we had moments too. Late-night talks, laughter over burnt pancakes, church picnics where for the first time in months, we smiled at each other without the weight of secrets. I'll never forget the day Emily sat me down and showed me the real Sarah's number in her contacts. We looked at it together. I saw the effort in her face, the willingness to be transparent, everything I had asked for that I never received. I copied the number, stored it in my phone. When I tapped it to send a text, just to say, "Good morning," I felt a shift. It wasn't just a text to Sarah. It was a confession of my own vulnerability, an admission that I needed to trust again. And so we moved forward, imperfect, but joined by the promise to keep talking, to keep choosing each other every day. Some nights, I still wake up tense, heart pounding at the memory of that chat window. But those nights pass, replaced by mornings filled with shared coffee and gentle smiles. Our anniversary trip to Lake Geneva still happened, delayed by healing, not canceled. We watched the sunrise over the water, wrapped in blankets, hands intertwined. Emily whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." And I realized that love isn't just about vows or perfect moments. It's about the messy, painful work of facing betrayal, choosing forgiveness, and rebuilding trust, piece by piece. I'm Michael, and this is our story. One of broken promises, raw confessions, and the quiet resilience of a love tested by fire. It's not over, and maybe it never will be, but I finally believe that some things are worth fighting for. The weeks that followed felt like walking a tightrope above an abyss. Every laugh we shared threatened to collapse under the weight of what had happened. I remember one Friday evening, 6 weeks after the Sarah revelation, when Emily invited me to the small gathering at her office for just a few drinks. My stomach knotted at the thought of being surrounded by her coworkers, including that old college friend, Ryan. My rational mind knew that Ryan lived in New York now and hadn't seen Emily in months, but my heart saw red. We arrived at the Rusty Mule, a dimly lit bar with exposed brick and Edison bulbs. Emily introduced me to everyone. "This is Michael, my husband." Their smiles were genuine, but I could feel the tension in Emily's jaw as she squeezed my arm. Ryan wasn't there. He'd flown in from Manhattan for a project kickoff, but had RSVP'd he wouldn't make it. Relief flickered through me until, halfway through my first drink, I saw a new name on her phone. Saturday? My pulse thundered. I suspected it was another message from someone else. I pushed the thought down, didn't want to make a scene in front of her boss. Back home, later that night, I lay awake waiting for Emily. When she finally stumbled in, laughter still on her lips, perfume wafting gently, I reached for her phone on the nightstand. She caught me before my hand touched the screen. "Michael, you promised," she said, voice small. "No more spying." I froze. The resentment I'd nursed these past weeks rose up like bile. "Then show me I don't have to," I whispered. "Let me see that there's nothing going on." Emily hesitated, looked at me with tears in her eyes. She unlocked her phone and brought up the messages. It was her friend Karen, asking, "Saturday night hike, are you in?" No hidden flirts, no secret rendezvous, just weekend plans with a fitness group. I felt every cell in my body relax and then contract with shame. I apologized, and she forgave me, but the damage was done. We both lay there in the dark, tangled together, and yet somehow still worlds apart. The next Sunday, we found ourselves back in that old chapel. The one where we said "I do." The pews were empty. The stained glass windows painted the carpet with colored light. We knelt before the altar, holding hands. Pastor Williams joined us, not to lecture, but simply to pray for renewal. As he spoke of mercy and new beginnings, I realized how hungry I was for a fresh start. How desperately I wanted to rebuild what I'd helped tear down. After church, we wandered the creek behind the churchyard, the water trickling over smooth stones. Emily leaned her head on my shoulder. "I want to trust you again," she said. "Just like I want you to trust me." I brushed a strand of hair behind her ear and felt the compass she'd given me in my pocket. It wasn't about finding direction in the world, it was about finding each other again, step by step. Rebuilding wasn't linear. There were days when the past flooded back. Her laughter when she talked about Ryan, the way I'd storm out of the restaurant that night. There were moments when I questioned if it would ever feel safe again. But then, there were the miracles. Like the Tuesday night she surprised me with tickets to my favorite baseball game, or the time she left a note on the bathroom mirror saying, "I love you, flaws and all." I began sharing more of myself, too. I told her about the late nights I spent worrying over my dad's health, the pressure I'd felt at work, the fear that I was failing as a husband. She listened without judgment, her hand on my knee, her eyes steady and kind. We also made new rituals. Sunday morning pancakes at the diner, followed by silent walks in the park. Midweek texts, just, "How's your day?" or a silly gif to make her smile. We set boundaries. No phones during meals, and an agreement to never send private messages to anyone without letting the other know. One evening, Emily called from her desk at work. She sounded excited, even giddy. Guess what? She held up a paper. She'd been promoted to project lead. I could practically hear her heartbeat through the phone. "I did it," she said, voice trembling with pride. I celebrated with her over speaker. Jason popped by with beers to toast. That night at dinner back home, I watched her laugh with that old spark in her eyes, and it hit me. This version of Emily, confident and fulfilled in her career, was the woman I'd fallen in love with. Months melted into a year. We celebrated our second anniversary at Lake Geneva, finally under the sunrise like we'd planned the first time. No phones at the table, just the water's gentle lap and the promise of a new chapter. Emily brought out 2 coffee mugs, one for each of us, inscribed with trust and grace. I raised my mug to hers and said, "To imperfect love." She smiled, tears shimmering, "To choosing each other every day." That morning, the horizon glowed pink and gold, and I felt something settle deep inside me, an unshakable belief that, though love can break, it can also heal stronger than before. We didn't erase the past, but we carried it with humility and honesty. Because real love, I've learned, isn't about never making mistakes. It's about what you do after you fall. And here we are, Michael and Emily, walking forward together, one imperfect, beautiful day at a time. The late summer days stretched languid and golden, as if time itself had decided to give us a second chance to bask in each other's company. I'd been up before dawn to catch the sunrise over Lake Geneva, but this time it wasn't an anniversary trip. It was a business conference I agreed to tag along for, just so Emily wouldn't have to travel alone. I watched her silhouette against the horizon, breathing in that familiar mix of fresh air and promise. Back home, our routine had settled into something sturdy and honest. Morning devotions together over coffee, sharing prayer requests and small victories. Evening walks around the neighborhood, sometimes in silence, sometimes rehashing the day's highs and lows. We still attended church every Sunday, but now we volunteered too. Emily teaching the youth group about resilience, me leading a men's Bible study on forgiveness. Working side by side helped us remember where we came from. Two flawed people bound by faith, striving to love like Christ loves us, grace upon grace. But life doesn't stay safely scripted, even after you think you've weathered the worst storms. One afternoon, at the hotel lobby's business center, I overheard Emily whispering on her phone, her tone low and urgent. I recognized the name she used, Agent Davis. My chest tightened. My pulse quickened. Part of me wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. She'd always been candid with me since the therapy sessions began. But another part of me still bore the scars of that night at Olivia's steakhouse. I slipped out of sight and peeked around the corner. She was pacing, clutching her phone. "Yes, I understand. But you can't tell anyone else yet. Not until we secure the funding," she said. "I'll have the report ready by Monday." The words didn't sound romantic or flirtatious. They sounded businesslike, measured. But in that moment, I felt that old familiar sting of betrayal. That evening, dinner in the hotel restaurant felt like walking on eggshells. The waiter poured our water, and I watched Emily's hand tremble ever so slightly. I forced myself to breathe. Finally, over her second glass of Pinot Noir, I asked, "Who's Agent Davis?" Emily set down her fork, eyes wide. "Michael, he's the senior underwriter I've been wired through." She caught herself. "I mean, the senior project manager for the grant application I'm working on. You know, my nonprofit board has been pushing to get this new youth outreach funded." Relief and guilt hit me like simultaneous waves. "I'm sorry," I said, voice low. "I'm still learning to trust you completely." She reached across the table, her hand warm against mine. "And I'll keep earning it," she promised. A month later, as September eased into October, our pastor announced a marriage retreat at the church's lakeside camp. We signed up on a whim, thinking it could be just another weekend away, but turned out to be a deep dive. Workshops on communication styles, forgiveness rituals, and even a trust fall exercise over the camp's pond. We climbed the rickety ladder, hearts pounding, and let ourselves fall backward, leaning fully on each other. When I caught her and she caught me in return, I felt the strength of our commitment more viscerally than any pillow fort or romantic sunset. That same weekend, we were invited to share our story anonymously in a small group setting. "Has anyone here faced betrayal in marriage and found a way back?" My voice shook as I spoke, confessing the rawness of that first discovery, the depth of the wound, and the slow, painful process of healing. When I was done, the room was still. Then one by one, couples stood up to speak words of encouragement. I realized something profound. Our pain didn't isolate us. It connected us to every other couple who had walked through fire and lived to tell the tale. By winter, the first snow fell on our little suburban street, and we welcomed another kind of change. The first positive line on the pregnancy test. We learned we were expecting in front of the same stained glass window where we'd knelt for forgiveness. I squeezed Emily's hand as the pastor blessed us with holy water. We both wept, tears of awe, gratitude, and a touch of fear. Because now, more than ever, we were building something bigger than ourselves. Pregnancy brought its own anxieties. Emma's kicks at 3 a.m., the swirl of hormones that left Emily weeping at Hallmark commercials. My own worry that I might somehow fail as a father the way I felt I'd failed her once. But each morning, before the sunrise, we read a psalm together and prayed for the little life growing inside her. Each night, we'd talk about what kind of parents we wanted to be, honest, present, unafraid to admit our mistakes. On Christmas Eve, our living room glowed with twinkling lights. We hosted a small gathering, friends from church, neighbors, our mentors at the counseling center. There was laughter, easy conversation, the smell of gingerbread. At midnight, we gathered around the tree. Emily handed me a small gift, a leather-bound journal. Inside the cover, she'd written, "To record every day we choose love." I pulled out another box from under the tree. A framed photograph of us from that first sunrise at Lake Geneva, with the compass mounted beside it. Underneath, a verse. I press on toward the goal, to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Christ Jesus. We held each other and remembered how far we'd come. from shattering betrayal to a mosaic of grace and truth. We weren't naive to the pain that life could bring, but we were determined to walk through it together, hand in hand, heart with heart, guided not by perfection, but by persistence. Because sometimes the greatest love stories aren't the ones without scars. They're the ones that learn to wear those scars as medals of resilience, each one a testament to the power of forgiveness, faith, and an unbreakable promise to keep choosing each other. The first months of parenthood were a whirlwind of adrenaline and wonder, as if we'd been launched into orbit without a manual. When our daughter, Grace, finally arrived on a crisp February morning, I stood at the foot of the hospital bed, tears streaming as Emily cradled our tiny girl for the first time. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors became a new kind of music, Grace's little heartbeat echoing alongside ours. The room was suffused with pale midwinter light, and for a moment the whole world felt suspended, caught between the past we'd survived and the future we would build. We named her Grace not only for God's mercy, but for the fragile beauty of second chances. As I cut the umbilical cord, I felt the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders more heavily than ever. We watched her yawn, tiny fist curled against her cheek, and I whispered that I'd spend every day earning the gift of her trust as fiercely as I had with Emily's. Emily smiled, exhaustion and joy battling in her eyes, and I knew we were both terrified and exhilarated to be parents. Our small apartment felt suddenly cavernous, filled with the hum of a new life. The nights blurred into a medley of diaper changes, soft lullabies, and endless feedings. I rose in the dark hours, terrified I'd wake Emily, but unwilling to let Grace cry alone. I'd cradle her against my chest and feel the rise and fall of her tiny body, marveling that something so delicate could teach me more about love than any vow or sermon ever could. But the raw tenderness of those first nights couldn't mask the tremors in our foundation. Postpartum hormones enveloped Emily in waves of emotion. Joy could flip to tears in seconds, and guilt over every misstep shadowed her smile. One evening, I found her at the kitchen table, blinking at the empty rocking chair as if it held a question she couldn't answer. "Do you ever doubt me?" she asked, voice small and brittle. My heart clenched. She sounded like the woman who'd hidden a chat on my anniversary. "I could never doubt you again," I said, but then paused. "But sometimes I worry that you think I'll leave if you're not perfect." She looked at me, confusion and relief mingling. I took her hand, tracing the lines of her palm. "I'm here," I said, "even when we're not perfect." Those nights we talked until dawn, about parenting fears, lingering regrets, and the parts of ourselves we'd left behind. We cried over the ways we'd hurt each other, and over the miracle of this tiny life that bound us tighter than any ring or prayer. With each confession, we laid another brick in a new foundation, one built on honesty, vulnerability, and the fierce commitment to face fear together. Gradually, routine became our ally. Sundays still belonged to church, but now we brought Grace to nursery, exchanging glances as we tucked her in under a rainbow blanket. We sat in the back pew, hands clasped, feeling the weight of community around us, other families, other stories of brokenness and hope. We volunteered to rock newborns for new moms, offering support where we once had needed it. I taught the men's group about the trials of marriage when a child arrives, how to navigate the shifting tides without losing sight of each other. Emily led a postpartum support circle, sharing her story so other women wouldn't feel alone. Work became another balancing act. I negotiated telecommute days, structuring my week around feedings and doctor appointments. Emily poured herself into grant proposals and community outreach, but when fatigue threatened to engulf her, I'd pick up the slack, bottling milk at midnight, running to the pharmacy for formula when supply ran low. We learned to ask for help. Jason babysat on weekends so we could rest. Our parents rotated shifts, offering meals and laughter. One afternoon in late spring, as sunshine filtered through our living room windows, I watched Grace learning to crawl. Her little knees sank into the rug as she inched toward her mobile of painted stars. Emily leaned over, encouraging her with soft words. I picked up my phone, not to spy, but to capture this moment of pure light, and as I snapped the photo, I realized how far we'd come. The compass from our anniversary trip, which I kept on my desk, felt less like a reminder of a journey and more like proof of the direction we'd chosen. Toward each other, every day, through every storm. And yet, life wasn't all sweet lullabies. There were still moments when old fears flickered. A delayed text back, a late stay at the office, a fleeting thought that the other might withdraw again. We tackled those shadows head-on. Monthly check-ins over coffee, a shared Google Calendar where we logged appointments and calls, and a ritual of Sunday confession. No judgments, just space to share what was on our minds. We learned to apologize quickly and forgive more swiftly, understanding that trust was a living thing needing daily care. Our second Christmas with Grace, we returned to Lake Geneva, not for our anniversary, but to celebrate her first holiday. We bundled her into a red snowsuit, and she giggled as snowflakes settled on her eyelashes. We sat by the fire in our cabin, nursing cups of cocoa, and opened one gift each. She got tiny mittens. We exchanged hand-painted ornaments depicting a compass, a journal, and a stork. Symbols of guidance, record-keeping, and new life. We laughed at the silliness, but our eyes glistened with gratitude for being here. Together, a family forged in trials and triumph. In the quiet moments when Grace finally drifted to sleep, Emily and I would sit by the window, hands intertwined, watching the moon glint over the frozen lake. We didn't need words. We'd survived betrayal, navigated the fierce tides of new parenthood, and emerged stronger not because we were flawless, but because we kept choosing each other. Life will always bring storms. Unexpected messages, midnight worries, the small betrayals of fatigue and frustration. But now we know how to navigate those waters. With faith that forgiveness can heal, with rituals that tether us, and with a love resilient enough to carry scars as emblems of all we've overcome. As I trace Emily's silhouette against the winter sky, I feel it again. This imperfect, indomitable love, still growing, still guiding us, like a compass pointing true north. By the following spring, Grace was toddling around our living room like a tiny explorer, her chubby knees wobbling, but her determination unshakable. One morning, I found her perched at the coffee table, flipping through our old photo album, my finger still frozen over the image of Emily and me in front of the chapel on our wedding day. She looked up at me, eyebrows scrunched in concentration, as if she were trying to puzzle out the story behind those smiling faces. My chest swelled. This little girl was the living, breathing proof of every hard-earned lesson we'd lived through. Emily and I had fallen into a new rhythm. I'd leave for work at dawn and kiss her forehead before she drifted from sleepy smiles into winks of motherhood exhaustion. She'd drop Grace off at the church nursery before her own day at the nonprofit. We texted throughout the day, not just about errands or appointments, but about small victories. Grace's first attempt at stacking blocks, a proposal acceptance from the board, a funny snort laugh from Emily whenever she hit a typo in her report. Those messages became our lifeline, reminders that connection is a continuous thread, not a single stitch. But life has a knack for testing you right when you think you're safe. One Wednesday afternoon, when the sun felt warm enough to drown out any lingering chill of winter, I got a call from the daycare. Grace had fallen from her little slide at the playground and bruised her arm. My heart lurched as I raced there, mentally replaying every moment I hadn't been by her side. I arrived to find Emily already there, cradling our daughter, her face pale with worry. She looked up at me with relief, but also something else, a tremor of guilt that reflected my own internal tremor. We held each other in the quiet hallway outside the nurse's office, whispering apologies for our respective absences. "I should have left work," Emily murmured, tears catching the light. "I got caught up in that budget meeting." I shook my head, brushing hair from her forehead. "I should have called more," I replied. "I was in back-to-back calls and—" My voice broke. We realized then that the same patterns that had once driven us apart were still lurking. Overcommitment, unspoken expectations, the temptation to bury ourselves in tasks instead of each other. That evening, after Grace fell asleep in her crib, Emily and I sat on the couch, exhaustion layered over us like blankets. I turned to her and said, "Let's choose differently." We drafted a new pact, a no-meeting Wednesday rule where one of us stayed home to focus on family, alternating weeks. We set phone-free dinners, weekend morning walks without agendas, and a shared calendar that highlighted not just work deadlines but also milestones, doctor's visits, preschool orientations, and yes, coffee dates. The first no-meeting Wednesday arrived like a breath of fresh air. I brewed coffee at home, Emily made pancakes with blueberries, and we watched Grace chase a butterfly in the backyard, her laughter high and free. It wasn't a grand gesture, it was just ordinary life, but it felt monumental, as if we were reclaiming territory we'd once surrendered to anxiety and unvoiced resentments. Summer came, and we decided to mark our third anniversary not at Lake Geneva, but on that same church lawn where we'd renewed our vows in prayer. Pastor Williams officiated a simple ceremony beneath the oak tree by the creek. This time there were no veils of expectation. Just us, our family, and a small circle of friends. Grace toddled around the altar, handing out petals from a flower child basket Emily had made. When we exchanged rings again, our eyes held not the bright idealism of two kids in love, but the steady warmth of survivors who had chosen to keep going. In the months that followed, Emily's career soared. Her team secured the grant, launched the youth outreach program, and her name became synonymous with compassionate leadership in our community. I took on a mentorship role at work, helping young professionals balance ambition with humanity. We celebrated each other's successes with the same fervor we'd once reserved only for pain. Of course, life still threw curveballs. There were days when Grace sobbed over skinned knees, days when I missed deadlines, days when Emily fought tears in the shower after an emotionally draining board meeting. Yet, every challenge became an opportunity to remember what we'd survived. That betrayal that nearly destroyed us, the letter that forced us to confront our weaknesses, the therapy sessions where we learned to listen without judgment. Those memories had become our compass, guiding us back whenever we strayed. One crisp autumn evening, I found Emily on our porch swing, cradling a steaming mug of cocoa. She looked up at the blank horizon, then at me, and smiled with that same crooked warmth I first fell for in youth group. I sat beside her, pulled her close, and said, "I'm so glad we kept walking." She traced the compass on my keychain, now worn smooth by years of use, and replied, "We never stopped choosing." I slipped my arm around her. Behind us, Grace's laughter echoed as she chased leaves in the yard. We didn't need to speak our vows again. We lived them. In every shared sunrise, in every apology offered freely, in every moment of grace extended without reservation. Because here's what I've learned. Love isn't a single perfect point in time. It's a living story, written in small acts of faithfulness, in unguarded conversations at midnight, in the courage to trust again and again, no matter what. And though our story began with a fracture, it never ends in blame. It carries forward, imperfect and unbreakable, guided by a compass forged in the fires of forgiveness. Every day, we choose each other. And that choice, I finally understand, is the truest form of love. The late summer sun had barely crested the horizon when Grace stood at the edge of the playground, clutching my hand and staring wide-eyed at the sea of new faces. It was her first day of kindergarten, and I could feel Emily's nerves mirroring my own. We'd both dreamed of this moment, her growing up, us passing our hard-won lessons on to her. But standing there in the morning light, I realized it held the same quiet terror as every milestone. What if we weren't enough to guide her? We walked her past the row of colorful cubbies, past teachers greeting each child with warm smiles, and paused at her little desk. Grace looked back at us, bright as a spark, and I felt a swell of pride, and a flash of that old doubt, the whisper that said, "What if they disappoint us?" I knelt to her level and said, "Have fun, sweet girl. We'll be right here when you're done." She waved, her backpack bobbing, and turned to join a circle of new friends. Emily wrapped her arms around me, soft against my chest. "We did it," she whispered. The rest of the day stretched out long and empty. I paced the coffee shop across the street, my phone in my hand, compelled to check for texts. Had she settled in? Was she happy? The clock hand crawled forwards. At precisely 3 o'clock, my phone pinged. A selfie from Grace, taken in class, her grin triumphant. Next, a message from her teacher. "She's doing great, already introduced herself and made 2 friends." I exhaled, my shoulders dropping for the first time since dawn. I texted Emily 2 words, "She's okay." When Emily and I met Grace at the gate, she ran into our arms, her cheeks flushed with excitement. She jabbered the whole walk home. A new friend named Marcus, singing "Twinkle Twinkle" with the class, and a paintbrush that tipped her purple thumb into a sticky puddle of joy. Watching her chatter, I thought back to how we'd almost lost our footing before. How whispers in the dark, unspoken fears, and secret messages had nearly torn us apart. Now, every day we chose transparency, shared calendars that included school events, nightly check-ins about our own feelings, and a weekend family meeting where we not only planned trips but also named our worries. That morning at kindergarten had felt so big because we'd learned that big things come not from perfect planning, but from showing up, together, even when we're unsure. Autumn deepened into November, and with it came a new opportunity for Emily, a speaking engagement at a national nonprofit conference in Seattle. It was an honor, one she'd earned through years of diligent service. But as the dates approached, I noticed the old unease returning in the small things. The late-night slide deck tweaks, the hush on her phone when I walked past her desk. Work travel hadn't once been an issue before, but the ghost of that first secret chat still hovered in corners of my mind. One evening, as we packed her suitcase, I watched her fold her favorite blouse and thought of all the ways I could resist the creeping suspicion. What if she's sending another message? Instead of letting the thought fester, I held her hand and said, "I trust you. Go show them the incredible leader you are." She looked at me, surprise, relief again, and hugged me tight. "Thank you," she breathed. "That means more than you know." I drove her to the airport early the next morning. She kissed Grace on the forehead and hugged me one more time before disappearing into the terminal. I sat in the car afterward, turning the compass keychain over in my fingers and reminding myself that trust, once renovated, needed ongoing care. So I made a quick decision. I would text her every day, no questions asked, just updates from home. Grace's new favorite bedtime story, the first frost of the season, the stray puppy that wandered into our yard. Those messages became our tether, a small ritual to keep us close across the miles. By Thanksgiving, Emily was back, and we gathered around the table with our families. Grace scurrying between cousins, my dad slicing the turkey, my mom grinning at how far we'd come. The preacher's quotation printed on the invitation read, "Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things." As I looked around at our table, at the daughter who embodied our second chances, at the woman who taught me the depth of grace, I felt every fragment of that verse settle in my chest. That night, after the last guests had left and the candles burned low, Emily and I stood by the fireplace, hands entwined. Grace was asleep in her crib upstairs, dreaming who knows what. We gazed at the compass on the mantel, its arrow pointed steadfast north. "Every year brings a new test," Emily said softly. I nodded. "And every test reminds me of why I married you." She leaned her head on my shoulder. "I'm grateful for the tests," she said. "They brought us here." I kissed her hair. "Here," I agreed, "is exactly where we belong." And in that quiet moment, surrounded by the glow of memories and the promise of tomorrow, we understood that our story would never be one of unbroken perfection, but of two flawed people choosing, again and again, to navigate life together with courage, faith, and a love that could withstand anything. That winter, just as the world beyond our windows turned crystalline with frost, we faced a challenge we hadn't anticipated: the arrival of unresolved grief. My father, whose dementia had deepened quietly over the past year, slipped further away during a snowstorm in late January. The phone call came while Emily and I were tucking Grace into bed, her tiny yawn a reminder of how tender life could be. My voice shook as I told Emily we had to drive north to the care facility. We loaded up the car the next morning, the roads slick with black ice. Grace sat between us, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit. Emily took my hand as we navigated those familiar backcountry lanes toward my parents' house, an old farmhouse that felt both sanctuary and trap, now that my dad could barely remember our names. When we arrived, my mother greeted us with red-rimmed eyes and a tremor in her voice. My father, frail and disoriented, stared out the kitchen window, as though trying to recall a world only he could see. I realized then how desperation can mirror betrayal. The way my heart clenched watching him struggle was akin to the chaos I once felt when Emily's texts undermined our marriage. I wanted to fix things instantly, restore him to the man who coached my little league team, who taught me how to bait a hook. But reality offered no quick fixes. I turned to Emily, whose calm presence felt like the solid ground I'd learned to trust. She slipped her arm around me and whispered, "We'll get through this together," echoing the promise we'd repeated to each other so many times. Over the next weekend, between hospital visits and phone calls to Medicare, we carved out moments for us. One afternoon, in the small visitors' lounge, Emily and I shared a cup of coffee under flickering fluorescent lights. I told her how guilty I felt for leaving her at home to care for our toddler during my dad's decline. She listened and then reminded me gently, "You never stopped showing up for me when I needed you most. Let me do the same now." Her words felt like a benediction, freeing me from the weight of unspoken expectations. Driving back home that Sunday, the car packed with grocery store sandwiches and a carton of juice boxes, we confessed how strained we felt sometimes, her between her nonprofit deadlines and new support groups for families of Alzheimer's patients, me between my project launches and my mother's calls. We realized the coping strategies we'd used for marital betrayal, open calendars, regular check-ins, could also support us through grief. We set up a weekly grief share call among close friends, a safe circle where we could say hard truths. We asked for more help with Grace, scheduling a teenage sitter so we could attend my dad's care planning meetings together. By February, my father settled into a memory care wing, and our grief share group became Lifeline and Salve. Emily even convinced her board to host a fundraiser for the local Alzheimer's chapter in his honor. She stood on stage in the church fellowship hall speaking of faith, memory, and love that endures beyond forgetting, her voice strong even as tears glistened on her cheeks. I watched from the front row, heart bursting with pride. At home that night, after the last guest left and the house was hushed, we sat by the fire, Grace asleep upstairs, and recounted the journey we'd taken since that fateful text on our anniversary. We acknowledged that grief, like betrayal, can fracture the heart, but also carve space for deeper compassion if we navigate it together. The compass on the mantel, now chipped at one corner, still pointed true north. We didn't map out our future that night in tidy lines. Instead, we held each other and listened to the wind moaning around the old farmhouse in our minds, the same wind that once carried whispers of pain. And with every breath, we chose again, to love through sorrow, to trust despite uncertainty, to keep walking forward, hand in hand, heart with heart, because sometimes the greatest journeys are the ones we never planned to take. The spring after my father passed felt surreal, as if we'd been standing in the middle of a storm and suddenly found ourselves on calm ground. The funeral was small. Emily and I stood side by side at the oak tree in the churchyard, watching the casket descend. Grace, too young to grasp the finality of loss, held a single white rose, pressing it into my palm with her chubby fingers. When it was over, Emily put her arm around me, her shoulder firm beneath my head, and I whispered that I felt adrift without him. She replied that he would be proud of how we'd carried on, how we'd built a family on the rocks of hardship and love. Over the next months, life resumed its rhythm, but we both sensed the undercurrents of change. Grace, now 4, was talking in full sentences and asking questions. Relentless, wondrous questions that caught me off guard. "Daddy, can you remember Great-Grandpa's voice?" she'd ask, and I'd struggle to paint a memory for her. Emily would gently remind me that stories live on, not just in our minds, but in the way we pass them forward. So each night we began reading from my dad's old journals, letting Grace hear his handwriting in my voice, letting his words linger in our living room long after the pages closed. Emily's nonprofit continued to flourish. They doubled the youth outreach programs, and with her leadership, they landed state funding. She was invited to testify before the state legislature, her voice carrying the weight of every teenager she'd helped steer away from gangs and despair. I sat in the gallery, heart swelling with pride and a tinge of envy. Here was the woman I'd fought to trust, commanding a room full of policymakers. Afterward, in the marble halls, she pulled me into a tight hug and said, "Thank you for believing in me." I realized then that belief is the most precious commodity we can offer one another. Without it, love withers. In my own work at the tech firm, I'd been passed over for a big promotion, something I'd been aiming for over the past year. The disappointment gnawed at me, flaring old insecurities about worth and achievement. Late one night, I found myself drafting an angry email full of excuses and blame, at my boss, at the company, at myself. But before I hit send, I remembered Emily's calm counsel from our early therapy days. Speak from need, not from fear. I scrapped the email, and the next morning I asked for feedback instead of revenge. It turned into a genuine conversation about growth opportunities. A few weeks later, my manager offered me a leadership role on a new project team. It wasn't the promotion I'd wanted, but it was a start, and more importantly, I learned to ask for what I needed without letting fear drive me. At home, our routines shifted again when we enrolled Grace in a local preschool. Suddenly, we were carers of an almost big kid. Uniforms, backpack checks, morning pep talks. On her first day, she broke into tears when I dropped her off. I knelt and told her she was brave, that I'd be back to pick her up as soon as the clock struck 3. She sniffled, offered a small smile, and turned back to her teacher. I walked out feeling like a ghost, but Emily was waiting in the hallway with 2 coffees. She pressed one into my hand and said simply, "Every goodbye is the start of a hello." Watching Grace thrive, bringing home artwork covered in glitter, learning to count to 20, performing a wobbly rendition of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star on the playground stage, reminded me of the strength of beginnings. Every morning she raced into my arms at pickup time, and every evening she sketched stick figures of our family, her scribbles sometimes mirroring the compass we'd given each other years ago. But just as we settled into that peaceful groove, life threw us another curveball. Emily's mother was diagnosed with a treatable cancer. Overnight, we found ourselves caring for another beloved parent. This time, we were more prepared. We shared the driving to appointments, split nights at the hospital, and kept each other grounded when fear made the walls close in. When Emily burst into tears in the oncology waiting room, I held her, reminding her that faith often shows up in small acts, bringing soup, fetching pillows, playing cards with her mom to keep her spirits up. We leaned on our grief share group again, and our therapist encouraged us to set boundaries so our own marriage didn't slip into neglect. We booked regular date nights, pizza and board games at home after the sun went down, and installed a no cancer talk hour every Sunday evening when we'd just be husband and wife, leaving every worry on the doorstep. By the time Emily's mother rang the bell for her last chemo treatment, we'd found a new equilibrium. We celebrated with cupcakes in the kitchen, Grace clapping her hands and showering her grandma with thank you hugs. My heart felt heavy and full at once, watching the woman who had once nursed me as a boy be held by the nursing my wife and daughter offered, felt like a circle closing, but also opening into something timeless. That summer, to mark 10 years since our first disastrous anniversary dinner, I planned a surprise vow renewal on the rooftop of our apartment building. I draped fairy lights around the railing, laid out a picnic blanket, and waited with a ring box repurposed from our original wedding. At dusk, I led Emily up the stairs, her eyes widening at the sight of the city skyline glowing behind me. I spoke from my heart, about the trust we'd rebuilt, the grief we'd shared, the joy of watching Grace become her own little person. I asked her to choose me again, every single day, despite the perils and uncertainties still ahead. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she said yes, and when I slid the ring onto her finger, one we had customized with the engraving Still North, I felt each moment of our journey press into my soul. The compass had become more than a symbol. It was our story, the needle that always points back to love. We danced under the stars, our laughter echoing off the rooftops. Grace, fast asleep in her crib below, would never know the full scope of what we'd endured, but she'd feel it. In the stability of her home, in the kindness with which we talked to her, in the way her mother and I still reach for each other's hands at the end of every day. And so I look forward, not because the past is gone, its shadows weave through every sunrise, but because every shadow needs light to exist. We are light bearers now, Michael and Emily, husband and wife, parents and friends, bound by the compass of forgiveness and faith. We navigate by the knowledge that love, real love, is not a place you arrive at, but a journey you commit to every moment. And as long as we keep choosing each other, with all our flaws and scars, we will always find our way home.